Aujourd'hui, on est très heureux d'accueillir Sally Waite, qui est professeure à l'université de Newcastle sur l'art et l'archéologie grecque. Et donc, il nous vient du nord de l'Angleterre, puisque à l'université de Newcastle, elle s'occupe des cours d'archéologie grecque et de la collection de Shefton, collection d'archéologie grecque et étrusque qui est au Great North Museum, comme elle va nous l'expliquer. Sally Waite a fait une thèse sur la représentation du genre dans la céramique attique qu'elle a soutenue à Newcastle en 2000. Et donc depuis, elle est à la fois spécialiste toujours de céramique grecque attique à figure rouge et aussi d'histoire des collections, dans lequel elle est plongée avec donc la collection de Brian Shefton et les archives aussi qui l'occupent dans des projets en cours. Elle a fait plusieurs publications sur ces questions et il y a quelques années, je vous montrer ici, mais vous le connaissez déjà sans doute, c'est la publication d'un colloque qui s'était tenu en 2013, je crois, à Newcastle avec beaucoup de spécialistes qui ont parlé de différents objets de la collection et auxquels François Lissarag avait participé. Et Sally me disait que François était aussi venu donner des cours à Newcastle quand il était à Édimbourg, et donc c'est lui qui avait suggéré que l'on invite Sally cette année, donc on est très heureux qu'elle ait pu se libérer en cette fin d'année. Au musée de Newcastle, elle a organisé depuis quelques années plusieurs expositions, et j'ai vu que les dernières expositions étaient aussi en ligne, notamment sur une exposition en 2021, Stories from the Archive, que vous pouvez aller voir sur le site de l'université, et qui, je pense, à cause du Covid et de l'empêchement des visiteurs de pouvoir se rendre sur place, ont poussé à se tourner vers le numérique, mais qui nous permet, du coup, à distance, de découvrir toutes ces histoires. Mais donc, merci encore d'être venu, et je vous donne la parole donc, pour découvrir cette collection universitaire qui est dans le cycle de plus la première collection anglaise que nous découvrons, puisqu'on a fait plusieurs pays, mais voilà, on commence l'Angleterre avec Newcastle. Merci, Sally.
Merci. Thank you so much for having me here. I apologise that my French is not good enough to speak in French. I'll try to speak slowly, and as there's so few people, do ask me if you want, interrupt me for questions as we go along. So it's with very mixed feelings that I'm here today. I'm delighted to be able to talk about Brian Shefton and the Shefton collection, but it's with a heavy heart because the invitation came to me from Francois. This book, City of Images, which was published in English in 1989, the year that I began my undergraduate degree at Newcastle University, it opened my mind to a new way of thinking about vases. And it was this book which led me to specialise in Greek art and to continue to do a master's and a PhD. I first met Francois in the 1990s in Paris. Brian Shefton facilitated that meeting, and his kindness and generosity stayed with me. And I was lucky to get to know him better when he was in Edinburgh a few years ago, and have many discussions with him about the collection, about Brian, and about my own research. While he was in Edinburgh, Francois came to Newcastle to give a masterclass for our graduate students. We took many objects off display for him to show us, and it was such a privilege to listen to his insights on these objects. When Francois talked about an image, it came alive. And I remember him talking about this small stem dish attributed to the Pythos painter in the collection, which I'd never really noticed before. But when Francois talked about the iconography and the way in which this symposiast was represented, it was as though I was seeing this anew. So to turn now to the subject of my paper, Brian Shefton and the Shefton Collection in Newcastle upon Tyne. This collection was created post-war. So Shefton began collecting in the 1950s, and the collection was completed before his death in 2012. So I think the first really important thing to stress is that this was Shefton's life work, and this collection was created in one man's lifetime, which is a remarkable achievement, especially given that there was never a lot of money for the collection. The collection is testimony to Brian's energy and enthusiasm and constant curiosity. When you met Brian, you didn't forget him. It's the most important collection of Greek and Etruscan art and archaeology outside London, Oxford and Cambridge. And these collections, of course, were built over hundreds of years. We have in Newcastle a collection of almost 1,000 objects, a wide range of objects that were carefully selected by Shefton to build up this unique collection. So just a small sample on this slide. We have strengths in metalwork, in bronze, arms and armour, particular strength in handles, bronze handles. Brian was particularly interested in bronze handles, but we have many objects in terracotta and a particularly strong collection in Athenian pottery. So many of these objects were bought at auctions in the sale room. Others were donations or long-term loans to the collection. The majority of the collection is on public display, but we also have a study collection. We have 4 cases. You see parts of 2 of them here. We have a case dedicated to metalwork. Then we have the image you can see here, a case of terracottas, and then 2 cases of pottery. And this is all stored in the Great North Museum. We're also particularly fortunate to have an intact archive. When Shefton died in 2012, he left a house full of things relating to his working life. Brian Shefton never threw anything away. He kept bus tickets, newspapers. So the problem with our archive is it is so big. It's 224 meters of shelving. So what you see here is just one row. We have several rows like this. We've slowly begun to sort the archive, and I have a PhD student who has been working in the archive. And it's really transforming our understanding of the collection and the formation of the collection, as well as Brian's life and research. So what do we have in the archive? We have many, many notebooks, research papers, letters, photographs, slides, and poignantly, many pairs of glasses we have found in the archive. And the archive reflects Brian's life in kind of momentous times of European history in the 20th century. I was very privileged to work with Brian in the last years of his life. And if City of Images was the beginning of my work on Greek vases, it was Brian that persuaded me to stay in the field. His enthusiasm was infectious. I was never formally taught by Brian. He had left or retired by the time I came to university, but he certainly taught me a lot while we talked about the collection, and he taught me to really see and really look at an object to understand it. So the format of my talk today, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Brian's life. Brian was a very private man and didn't talk a lot about his family or what had happened to him in his earlier life. I'm very fortunate that Brian's daughter, Penny Shefton, has allowed me to show some family photographs today. I'll move on to talk about the history of the collection, and then Shefton as a collector, before looking at some of our Athenian vases. And then I'll finish off by talking about how the collection is used for teaching and research, and also increasingly now in the UK, the importance of what we call public engagement, of working beyond the academy with school children and other visitors to the museum. So to begin, a brief biography of Brian Shefton. So Shefton was born in August 2019 in Cologne, and he is the baby there with his older brother. He was born Bruno Benjamin Sheftelovitz. He anglicised his name to Brian Shefton during the Second World War. Here he is with his parents and brother. Shefton's father, Isidore Sheftelovitz, was a professor of Indo-Iranian philology at the University of Cologne. Shefton attended a Catholic school in Cologne In 1933, when the family fled Germany because of Nazi persecution, he was one of 4 Jewish boys at this school. In 1989, he received an honorary doctorate from Cologne University, which is, you can see here. This was a really significant moment for him, as his father had worked at the university and lost his job in 1933. So the family moved to England, first to Ramsgate in the south of England, and then after a year, Isidor Shefton was offered a job at Oxford University in 1934, and Brian took up a scholarship to Magdalen College School in Oxford. Unfortunately, his father died suddenly in December of 1934. In 1938, Shefton went as an open scholar to Oxford, to Oriel College, to study ancient history. In Oxford, Shefton was drawn to the study of Greek archaeology. He claimed that this vase in the British Museum sparked his interest in Greek pottery and led to him requesting to join John Beasley's class at Oxford, despite missing the date for enrolment for this class. He managed to persuade Beasley to allow him to attend. So the main influences at Oxford on Brian Shefton were John Beasley and also Paul Jacobstahl. And the influence of both of these scholars is evident in Shefton's subsequent work and also in his collecting activity. His earlier work focuses particularly on vases, including his translation and substantial rewriting of Arius and Hermer's history of Greek vase painting in 1962. And Jacobstahl's influence is clear in Shefton's later work, where he focuses on Greek and Etruscan material culture and particularly its distribution in the extremities of the Greek world. The archive preserves Shefton's notebooks from Oxford. Rather confusingly, he's using old school books for his notes. And I'm guessing that this photograph is around about this time. So Shefton's studies at Oxford were suspended, interrupted by the Second World War. And Shefton was briefly interned as an enemy alien in 1940, but gained an exemption, which you see here, and joined the British Army. And it's during this time that he changed his name from Bruno Sheftonovitz to Brian Shefton. After the war, he resumed his studies in Oxford and graduated with a first-class degree in 1947. And this letter of introduction from John Beasley was brought to my attention by Deffryn Williams, and I think it kind of summarised Brian at this time, a very able and interesting man. Following Oxford, Shefton travelled in Greece and Turkey for 3 years. He had a scholarship at the British School in Athens And he was involved in excavations at Old Smyrna, the Athenian Agora, and Pericora. He travelled extensively despite the ongoing civil war. He often told tales about walking in Greece. He walked from Olympia to the Temple of Apollo at Vases, apparently the first person after the Second World War to do this. It's a distance of 55 kilometres, 12 hours walking time. And this was in the midst of the Civil War. He could hear gunfire in the mountains and had encounters with packs of wild dogs in the hills. So that is true dedication and determination to see what he wanted to see in Greece. And this passion for travel was something that was a feature of Brian's life. He spent much of his time in Europe and further afield. And just months before his death, he was attending a conference in Basel. On his return to England, Shefton was appointed as a lecturer in classics at the University College of South West at Exeter, now Exeter University. And there he discovered in the Royal Albert Museum a cardboard box of fragments of this vase here, which you see, which Shefton attributed to the Jenner painter. And I thank Lindsay Koo for this photograph. In 1955, Shefton took up a lectureship at Newcastle at King's College, which was then part of Durham University, became Newcastle University in the 1960s. And Brian told the story of how when he travelled to Newcastle and he saw Grey Street, which is the central street, Greek Revival Street in Newcastle. It's the most Instagrammed street in the UK, apparently. But Brian said that when he saw this street, he felt he could live and work in Newcastle. It was the place for him. And he remained in Newcastle until his death. In 1960, he married Jutta Abel, a translator from Sweden, who was instrumental in facilitating Shefton's work. And of course, women often get written out of history. But Jutta was responsible for typing Shefton's manuscripts, helping him with translation, and of course for managing the house and their daughter, Penny Shefton, who was born in the early 60s. And Brian told me once when Jutta was in hospital that he couldn't understand how people could possibly work when they had to do laundry and cooking and manage a house as well, which made me feel better about my lack of productivity at times. But Jutta facilitated Brian's work, and he would often disappear to Europe. Penny tells me they often didn't know where he was, travelling around every summer, and they would go to Sweden. In 1984, Shefton retired. I shouldn't really call it retirement because this was one of the most productive phases of his life. He was working until just a few weeks before his death. During this time, he published a number of articles, many of which highlighted his interest in the distribution and influence of Greek art in Iron Age Europe. Shefton was appointed as a senior lecturer in 1960, a reader in 74, and he had a personal chair, became a professor in 1979. In 2005, he was given an honorary fellowship of Newcastle University. And Sir John Byrne, I think, summed up Shefton. He said that Shefton is the stuff of what great academic institutions are built, imaginative, bold, and irrepressible. This picture of Shefton was on a trip that we took to Newby Hall, which is a stately home in North Yorkshire with a fantastic sculpture collection. And Brian was tireless in his work and enthusiasm. We had to stop to have some lunch, but Brian insisted on carrying on, even though he was in his 90s, and wanted to see every piece of sculpture. And this enthusiasm and curiosity was undiminished by age. He embraced modern technology, and he was always very open to new ideas. So to move now to a history of the collection, Shefton spoke of the collection as his greatest academic achievement. At the beginning, there was very little to suggest that the collection would come to dominate his career. He was encouraged by Charles Bosanquet, who was the rector of King's College, and you can see him here with Martin Luther King. This was a momentous moment in the history of Newcastle University in 1967. We were the only university in the UK to give Martin Luther King an honorary doctorate. And there's some old film footage of this occasion, and it was lovely to spot Brian Shefton in the academic procession on that occasion. So Charles Bosanquet was born in Athens. He was the son of the archaeologist Robert Carl Bosanquet, who was director of the British School at Athens. You can see him in the centre of this image. So Bosanquet had an interest in Greek art and archaeology. Newcastle had a reputation for the teaching of Roman art and archaeology. Of course, we're situated right on Hadrian's Wall. And Bosanquet wanted Brian to encourage the teaching of Greek archaeology. He was given £100. This figure is often disputed. It's often said that he was given £25 originally, but the work in the archive that my PhD student has been doing has confirmed categorically that it was £100. And we think that sometime in the 1980s, the then curator of the museum, Professor Tony Sporforth, changed the story to £25, and then Brian continued with the £25. But he had £100 to buy what was originally thought to be 3 Greek vases, but in fact, again, work in the archive has revealed that these were the first 4 objects that Shefton purchased. And he purchased them very quickly. He was given the money in 1955, and within months he had purchased these items. One of the things that we hadn't realised was that the numbers, the accession numbers in the collection, don't bear any relationship to the date items were acquired. So for a long time we thought numbers 1, 2 and 3 were the first objects in the collection. So I want to talk you very briefly through the display history of the collection because it's quite interesting to see the shifting displays. So this is the first display of the Shefton collection in the Shefton Gallery, an art gallery within the university, in 1956. So you can see how quickly the collection is already growing. And also within this display, some items from the Society of Antiquaries in Newcastle upon Tyne for a small collection of Greek vases, and these objects were included. Shefton worked on this exhibition with Ralph Holland, who was an art history lecturer, and Shefton always talked very fondly about this first exhibition, which, as you can see, was arranged very much on aesthetic grounds. And Shefton, I think this was his preferred of all the displays. This was the one he came back to. Following this temporary exhibition, the collection was moved into a room in the Percy building with the Department of Classics. This is in the early 60s in a kind of museum room. And then it was moved down a floor into a purpose-built museum, which was known as the Greek Museum, which you can see here. In many ways, this was the heyday of the museum. Through a job creation scheme, Shefton was able to employ a team of people to work on the collection, to catalogue, to draw, to photograph and conserve objects in the collection. And this is the period in which our card index catalogue, which we still operate on, was made. This little note which we found in the archive, which tells us that the Antiquities Department of Christie's auction house phoned Shefton to say you can have a shattered vase, adds to our understanding of the history of the collection. This note refers to the fragments of the Blenheim crater. This was a crater which had at one time belonged to the Duchess of Marlborough, was displayed at Blenheim Palace and was to be sold at Christie's. We don't know exactly what happened. I've been in touch with Christie's archivist, and it's possible that the vase was broken while it was at Christie's. And the fragments were then given to Shefton and restored by Steve Koob in the late 1970s. We would never have had a vase of this size in our collection if it hadn't been for this unfortunate accident. This is the restored vase, the name piece of the Blenheim painter. And it's an example of how Shefton's connections with the art market led to the acquisition of a vase which would have been way beyond his budget. Shefton's retirement in 1984 was marred by an arson attack on the museum. Shefton described this event in 2008. So a car tyre was placed in the lobby outside the museum and set alight with petrol. There was substantial damage. The cases at the front of the museum shattered. There were many bronzes there, and the fire burned fiercely. We don't know why this attack took place. Shefton suspected it was about cultural property and the fact that these objects had come through the art market to Newcastle. Some of the objects in our collection do have dubious backgrounds. We do have material that was looted, and we feel very strongly that it's important to be open and honest about this as we look through the archive, but also to recognise that Shefton was operating in a very different world to the world in which we work today. On this slide, you can see one of the vases damaged in the fire and reconstructed there. In the 1990s, the Shefton collection moved into an old chemistry laboratory. So this is it before refurbishment. And this is 1994, the formal opening of the Shefton Museum. So you can see on this slide Professor Shefton, Jutta, his wife, Tony Sporforth, the curator of the museum, and John Boardman, and the Vice-Chancellor of Newcastle University. It was named officially the Shefton Museum of Greek and Etruscan Art and Archaeology, and Shefton was very proud that he had a museum named after him, which he told me most people only get after they've died. He had the pleasure of it for quite a while. Although the museum was open to the public, it was primarily a teaching collection. It was very difficult to find the museum within the university campus. The cases were arranged chronologically and typologically, which made it an ideal collection for teaching with. And I used to teach many classes in that museum. But in 2009, the collection moved again to the Great North Museum, where it is now. So the Great North Museum, originally the Hancock Museum, was actually a natural history museum in Newcastle. And it was refurbished and reopened in 2009, and all the university's archaeology collections were moved into this refurbished museum, which is just on the edge of the university campus. It is a university museum, although it is run by Tyne and Weir Archives and Museums Services, so it's run by our city council. The people who work in the museum are employed by the city council, but the majority of the funding for the museum comes from the university. This was a £26 million redevelopment. This slide shows the original conception for the redevelopment, and you can see on the rear of the museum a massive exhibition space was created. In the museum, natural history collections are combined with archaeological and ethnographic collections. So here you see the Hadrian's Wall Gallery. That's Hadrian's Wall running through the centre of the gallery. This is a kind of Enlightenment museum in a way, but combining these different collections under one roof. The Shefton Gallery was to be this very long, thin gallery on the first floor of the museum. And the design has not been without its problems. Shefton was disappointed in this display. The lighting is not fantastic, and the interpretation is very limited. It's certainly not easy to teach in this space anymore. There's recordings of Greek myths. You can press buttons and hear these recordings, which people tend to walk by and press all the buttons, so you get kind of cacophony of Greek myths. Also, because this is a public museum, it's a very different kind of museum. The Great North Museum has 500,000 visitors a year, so this is a substantial number of visitors. 30,000 school children visit the museum each year. And although this makes it harder to use the collection for teaching and research, it also secures the future of the collection because it is the university's public face, which is increasingly important to the university. In 2009, the gallery was named the Shefton Gallery in honour of Professor Shefton's 90th birthday. And he gave a lecture on this occasion, which I will refer to later on. So now, Shefton as a collector. If at first Shefton was an unintentional collector, he soon discovered that he had a flair for this. He was charming, he was persuasive, and he was determined. Shefton was a familiar figure in the sale rooms of London and the arts fairs of Europe, operating across the worlds of academia and the art market in a way which would be inconceivable today. He was an enthusiastic collector. On occasion, he even bid against himself. On his 90th birthday, he spoke of the collection as a combination of luck and his ability to see, to distinguish when things look like gold, they are in fact dross. I'm not sure dross is a really common English word, but basically means they're rubbish. So when things are gold, they're in fact rubbish, and the other way around, seeing what looks like rubbish is in fact gold. Shefton had a unique gift for identifying objects at auction which were often overlooked by others. An example of this is an acquisition of this unusually shaped oinokoi, a rare shape, which was purchased in 1964. And my PhD student, Daisy Alice Vaughan, who's been working on the histories, the extended object biographies of some objects in the collection, has shared her research with me for this next little bit. So she's been working with the annotated auction catalogues, which we have in the archive. And you can see here Shefton's notes on the item. So this vase was within a lot of 2 black figure lekythoi and 6 other pieces. And you can see Shefton's writing is really difficult to decipher, but you can see that he has noted the Median painter, which wasn't highlighted in the auction catalogue. this Pilique, which is, I think, probably our most published vase in the collection. It's one of the disadvantages of the collection is how little published it is, but once something becomes published, it kind of snowballs and then it's published more. This one is attributed to the pan painter, and Shefton told the story that he was the only one who had noticed this. He was very excited when he went down to the sale in London, and he recounted a story about how he was sitting next to a woman on the train and he couldn't help himself from telling her how excited he was that he was going to purchase this vase that no one had recognised. And then as he got off the train, he had a sudden panic that this woman was going to go to the auction and bid against him. It didn't happen, and Shefton secured the vase. And again, we have the notes from the Christie's catalogue here. And Shefton's eloquent description of this scene. Again, like Francois, he had a way of bringing the iconography alive. And conveys that what he saw as the kind of anxiety of this older woman walking behind the Kenephoros. The archive also gives us information about conservation, which has taken place. Here, a description of some restoration here to remove some varnish on this vase. Conservation sometimes led to exciting discoveries. This bronze spear butt had an inscription which was only revealed upon conservation, suggesting that it was manufactured in Macedonia during the time of Alexander the Great. Shefton also collected on behalf of others and in a personal capacity. So one of the problems we have with the collection is untangling what belonged to Shefton and what belonged to the university. Shefton wanted to retain some of the collection for himself to use as leverage. There were times when the future of the collection looked very bleak within the university. So he often persuaded the people that he collected for to gift objects to the collection. He collected on behalf of a prominent Newcastle businessman, Lionel Jacobson, and some objects within the collection are on loan from the family trust. Some were gifted to the museum. You can see two examples here. Perhaps the most remarkable story concerns this Lionhead's water spout, which Shefton acquired in 1974 at auction and soon recognised the other half belonging to the Swiss collector Leo Mildenberg, which was on tour in an exhibition, and Shefton saw the exhibition catalogue. When the Mildenberg half was in America, Shefton persuaded Jennifer Niels to take a cast, which is this rather unremarkable object which we have rediscovered, the cast edge, which confirmed that the two halves belonged together. You can see them here too, and you can note the very different way in which they've been preserved as well. It's believed they were separated in antiquity. The lionhead waterspouts comes from a rural shrine sanctuary in South Italy, just outside Metaponto. And Shefton wrote to Leo Mildenberg asking him to give his lion head to Newcastle. Mildenberg refused, and saying it was an important part of his own collection, but promised that when he died, he would leave it to the Shefton collection, which is what happened. He died in 2001. It came to Newcastle in 2004. So I want now to talk a little bit about some of the highlights of the collection. I'm going to focus specifically on Attic vases, although we do have a good collection of Corinthian pottery. I'm going to focus on the figured vases. We have a large collection of Attic black glaze as well. So we have a number of black figured pots, and this is an example of one of these, a column crater with a representation of Dionysus on one side and a Scythian archer on the reverse. We have a small selection of white ground, this alabastron, which has been published by Jennifer Niels, which is a group showing African archers. We have 3 white ground lekythoi, the first of which a mourning woman, and then 2 attributed to the Achilles painter. This one, quite interesting, shows a mistress and maid scene, and the so-called maid is wearing a Persian dress. And then we have an image of a man heavily wrapped in his mantle, approaching a grave stele, on the reverse of which there is a young man dressed in travelling attire as an ephebe. And also on this slide, I don't think you can quite see there, but we have little Idola, little souls floating in the background. We also have an amphora, an arming, warrior departure arming scene attributed to the Achilles painter. And this interesting Panathenaic shape amphora, which shows 2 youths with a ritual basket, a canoon, with little branches that you can just see coming out of it here. We also have a small Dinos, which is attributed to the Altamura painter, which has a very interesting frieze of heroic warfare with contemporary hoplite armour. So there's a chariot, which you can just see the horses on here. And this Kylix, which shows a mythic scene, Heracles at Pholos's cave. You can see he's just dipping his oinokoi into the pithos. We also have this really beautiful fragment of a red figure cup, and particularly like this, the detail of the quiver with the bird's head here on the Scythian archer. A cup, a fragmentary cup, which shows a long jumper with his jumping weights and the athlete's bundle behind him in the field. One of the positive outcomes of the move to the Great North Museum was the fact that Tyne and Weir and our archives and museums collections were included within the Shefton Gallery. So we have a number of vases now within the Shefton collection that belong to Tyne and Weir museums and archives. This is a cup showing athletes on the exterior, a bearded man beside a Lutheran on the interior. Also from the Tyne and Weir Archives and Museum collection, this appliqué which shows hoplite warrior and Amazon. There's a small oinokoi attributed to the bull painter, which is interesting because of its price inscription incised onto the base before firing, so referring to the quantity, 20, the description, they're painted vases, and the price, which relates to approximately half an obol per item, so each vase was worth half an obol. We have a red figure koos, possibly used in the Antisteria festival, although a kind of strange representation. Most of these vases, of course, show smaller children, although there are some representations where what look like adolescents are shown crawling along the floor, so probably a lack of accurate representation of children. A couple of interesting lekythoi. This here shows a youth holding a kithera beside a column, and here a woman with flower and mirror beside a calathos and chair. There's a remarkably similar lekythos in Copenhagen collection. We also have a number of fragments, many of these small fragments, but also a number of larger fragments. This one from a battle, Lutrophoros, which shows a warrior beside a stele. So those are just some of the highlights of the red figure vases in the collection. To conclude, I'm just going to talk briefly about the collection in terms of teaching and research and public engagement. So the collection was originally conceived of as a teaching collection. Brian received the money to build up a teaching collection. And teaching continues to the present day. And we've got a little snapshot here. The black and white photograph at the top is one of Shefton's classes. And you can see the black figure column crater, which we've just been looking at. And then in the 1980s, we have one of Tony Sporforth's classes in the museum. And then moving into the 1990s, this is one of my graduate classes. So we use the collection extensively for teaching. We are able to take items from display when we want to use them for teaching. And we teach all stages of undergraduates and postgraduates with the collection. Recently, we've run quite an interesting project using this votive uterus, a votive womb, from the collection. And the purpose of this project was to explore the value of object handling for students as and for teaching as a pedagogical approach, so quite a different way of using objects. This was a collaboration with fine art, so we worked with fine art students, with archaeology students, and with psychology students. And the project demonstrated the transformative effect that actually having access to objects to handle can have on student learning and facilitate quite radical forms of teaching and learning which go against the kind of mass lectures that we increasingly see with our large student numbers. And the students worked on creative responses to the votive uterus, and the experience of learning was an embodied experience. And you can see it looks very strange on slides, but it was a very interesting way of teaching and learning. And we'll be running an exhibition on this project later in the year in the Great North Museum. For Shefton, the collection was as much for research as it was for teaching. He was drawn to objects that had research potential, and his own research was often supported by the collection and by his acquisitions, which were influenced by his own specific research interests. So we only have one coin in the collection. Shefton wasn't interested in coinage. We have a number of coins from the Society of Antiquaries collection, which we can draw on. Shefton published a number of objects from the collection in archaeological reports of 1969 to 70, and this small publication gives some insight into what motivated him as a collector. This small publication, Greek Arms and Armour, it was a booklet, was a product of the 1970s job creation scheme, and it was conceived of as the first in a series of guides to the collection, an ambition which unfortunately has not been realised. We do have in the archive the second of these books preserved, which would have been on Etruscan myths and monsters. And we hope that in the future we will be able to revise and publish that. Shefton was an international scholar. He worked across many different countries, and as his daughter points out, he made connection in a fractured, war-torn and revenge-ridden Europe on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And I think it's really important to remember this now in the present day. His research focused on the contexts of Greek and Etruscan material culture, and in that he was ahead of his time. And now, of course, there's much research on the markets and distribution of Greek painted pottery. Shefton was an aficionado of the distribution map, and he was interested particularly in the Castillo Cup. We have 3 in our collection. This is one of those. Brian Sparks published these in on a fascination of objects. They're rarely found in Greece, but distributed widely. And this is one of Shefton's distribution maps showing where the Castillo cups had been found. He often included objects from the collection in his publications. This little bowl, or it's often called a dishy, which shows in the interior a wheel motif, and on the exterior, underneath the foot, an amphora. He uses this to explore secondary distribution from spina of Greek pottery. He was also interested in the relationship of metal and clay. And these two situli in the collection were particular favourites of his. The slide here shows a clay situla which allowed Shefton to explore the influence of Greek art on Etruscan art, from which he moved in this publication to a review of the female centaur, which then led him into an examination of the Persian rhyton, which is held by the centaur, and the distribution of the rhyton in the Greek world and its periphery. This image of the bronze situla on the right, Shefton argued that these situlae had a Greek and Aegean origin, and he traced again the distribution pattern of these. And looking closely at the decorative motif, the central core of the palmette, he argued that these were known in Etruria, and from Etruria they were distributed to the northern Alps. This is the very last item which was acquired for the, oh sorry, no, apologies, skipped one. Handles. Bronze handles were a particular fascination for Professor Shefton. He was particularly interested in bronze vessels, and of course the handles often survive. And we have many, many handles in our collection. Again, his research shows his debt to Jacob Stahl and the interest in Iron Age burials. And this Stamnos he brings into a publication of Stamnos, which was found in Germany. This is the last item that was acquired for the collection in 2002. We don't collect anymore. This was a Rhodian bronze oinokoi, which I think illustrated the way in which times had changed subsequent to the 1970 UNESCO legislation. So Shefton picked up this bronze oinokoi on sale or return basis in Switzerland. He kept it for some time in Newcastle before asking if it could be acquired for the collection. This was a really difficult acquisition because obviously due diligence needed to be exercised and advice was taken. The provenance was traced, and we were able to acquire this vessel. But Shefton was told there was to be no more acquisitions. It's obvious why he wanted this vessel, because this was the subject of his publication. And the slide does nothing to show the magnitude of this vessel and the beautiful decoration on the handle panel, which you can see the similar decoration on the front of Shefton's book. So Shefton originally, following Jacobsdahl, suggested that these large bronze vessels were Rhodian in origin, East Greek. Later in his life, he reassessed this, and in his 2009 publication, he moves towards suggesting that these are, in fact, Etruscan vessels. So research after Shefton, we've continued to try to promote the collection, but it's difficult because there are very few of us in Newcastle. So this book, which was edited by myself and Andrew Parkin, who is the keeper of archaeology at the Great North Museum, and John Boardman, was the result of a conference in honour of Brian. This was the book that Brian wanted on the collection. He had named the people that he wanted to write on the collection. He had chosen the title for this book, On the Fascination of Objects. And he was and continued to be fascinated by objects. The little ascos was what Francois chose to write on. Each contributor chose the object within the collection they would like to publish. I published this red figure, Calathos, which belongs to the Society of Antiquaries collection, but is in the Shefton Gallery. This has an interesting history. It was found in Athens by Lucieri, who was working for Lord Elgin, and it was drawn by the painter Ong. You can see a little sketch there, and was also, the figures became part of a wall painting for the Villa Kerylos in Nice, which was never actually realised, but preserved in the archives. I've also published this oversized Athenian drinking cup because I was interested particularly in the hanging sandals, which you can't see, unfortunately. They're kind of on the tip of the kylix. And I was really lucky to benefit from Francois' insights into this vase. Particularly, we discussed the kind of unusual combination of the altar and what looks like a money bag hanging in the field. Andrew Parkin, who is the keeper of archaeology, is also published on the collection. In 1983, Shefton secured a permanent loan of more than 100 objects from the Wellcome Trust. One of these was this marble statuette of Nike, which was once in the collection of the eminent Victorian art critic John Ruskin, who was credited with discovering the pre-Raphaelite painters. Parkin's also published 3 Etruscan mirrors in the collection. The central one shows Cassandra and Ajax. The one here shows Eos and Tithonus, and then this one shows Larsa. He's also published this giant porphyry foot, which is a small bit of Roman archaeology to sneak into the collection. This was also part of the Wellcome bequest, and it belonged at one time to Thomas Hope. Thomas Hope was a great collector of Greek vases. He was an arbiter of style in Regency England, and his house became a precursor to the modern museum. He opened it up for viewing. The Blenheim crater, which I mentioned earlier, was once in Hope's collection. We can see it here on a figure from Hope's publication, Household Furniture. In this publication, Hope also included illustrations of his vase rooms. He had 4 vase rooms within his house in Duchess Street in London. Most of these craters are bell craters. We like to think that perhaps this is our Blenheim crater in central space above the fireplace. The move to the Great North Museum also reunited 4 vases from the original Hope collection. So the Blenheim crater, which was in the Shefton collection, and then 3 vases that were in the Tyne Archives, the museum collection, once displayed in the City Art Gallery. So this late red figure crater attributed to the hare hunt painter, and then 2 Apulian bell craters, this one and this one. And I'm currently working on a publication of these 4 vases and their history. I'm nearly finished. Shefton was always keen to embrace new technologies. He loved scientific methods to provide further insight to the collection. This is an early X-ray of our black glaze rattling cantharos. You can see the clay pellets in the rim, which allows this cup to make a rattling sound. This was a trip to the hospital, which I took with Brian Shefton, where he persuaded a doctor to use an endoscopy to look within the vases. Shefton was working on these 2 vases, a pine cone oinokoi and a head vase. He thought they were from the same workshop. He wanted to look at the way in which they'd been made, where you could see very clearly, I think in the middle picture, the mould, the kind of bulge of clay from the mould. We recently have received quite a large grant to use university laboratory equipment to shed light on 10 objects in our collection through scientific analysis. We're focusing on the methods of manufacture, the decoration and the conservation of these objects. Just share here with you some initial work. This is an ongoing project. I think it's been really interesting to see these objects under such high magnification, to see the economy of lines that the painters used. I don't know if you can see here, to see the preliminary sketch lines for this basket, and also to see where the painters had changed their minds and over-painted certain areas. We're working on this calpis in the collection, which is really difficult to determine what is overpainted, what is reconstruction, what is fill. We're hoping that we will be able to reconserve this vase as part of the project. We've also been able to, I don't think it's working on your, oh, maybe here, yes. Hopefully it will, maybe it won't work on. No. We've also been able to look inside. This is a CT scan of the little bore, and I can show you actually that within this, we were able, to see the fingerprint of the potter pressing the clay into the mould. And finally, the future of the collection. So the reason that we have this large grant to undertake scientific research is on the condition that these results are disseminated to a public audience. Newcastle University is a civic university. It aspires to play a role in the social, economic and cultural development of the city and the northeast of England, which is a deprived area of the country. Newcastle has the largest food bank in the UK. So we have been working for some years with local schools, and the project that we're now running, we've been working with women's groups as well. This is a recent group. You can see we were looking at the Pelicae with the Coniferous. We've worked with schools for a long time and created resources in England. The study of ancient Greece is part of the national curriculum. Children learn about ancient Greece when they're around 7, 8, 9 years of age. We've created resources for primary schools based on the collection. In order to promote the collection, we've also had a number of exhibitions. This one at Belsae Hall, which is an amazing Greek revival building. Charles Monk, who built this, designed this house, spent his honeymoon, 3 years honeymoon in Athens. And this was modelled on the Hephaestion. And it was a perfect location. It's empty inside. We had an exhibition there where we worked with the local primary school. This exhibition has become, or partly kind of changed into an online exhibition. During COVID, during the pandemic, we moved towards thinking of ways that we could continue to promote the collection. This follows Charles Monk's journey through Greece, bringing items from the collection in to relate to the history of Belsae. So this is the wild man of Belsae, and objects we could use to link with that from our collection. So you can explore the history of Belsae and also the history of the collection. This is an exhibition that we had in 2019 to celebrate the centenary of Shefton's birth. This is, you can see here, this is my PhD student, Daisy Alice Vaughan, and she had the opportunity to create an object biography for the Blenheim crater. So we had a screen which projected different images which showed the different contexts in which the crater had been during its long lifetime. Some of this collection is now part of our online collection, Stories from the Archive, where we have case studies of many of the objects that I've talked about today. So, Shefton began his 90th birthday lecture with the statement, "I want to stun you into a realization of what has been built up here." I hope that I've been able to do a little of that. This was one of Shefton's favourite objects. It's a large, fragmentary Etruscan red figure amphora, and years ago I had the pleasure of sharing my office with this vase, which is now on display And Shefton would delight in telling me that there was one of these in the Hermitage, one in the Louvre, and one behind my easy chair in the office. The collection's a tangible reminder of Brian's life and research and a lasting legacy for the city of Newcastle. Just to acknowledge particularly Brian's daughter Penny Shefton, who continues to support us in our battle with the archive, Andrew Parkin, the Keeper of Archaeology, and Daisy Ellis Vaughan, my PhD student, some of our funders there as well. And I hope that that was just to time.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It was a really passionate presentation of this collection, and was built by this man, this scholar, and for us it's so interesting in many ways because there's a lot of connections with the previous presentation we had, mostly on university collections that were built before this time, more ancient in France or in Germany, and also so it is very particular that it was only begun in the 50s, and also of course all the link with the archives that is what I think we could really talk about it because we have also to work on archaeological art historians' archives, and it's always we've seen the importance of these and also the complexity of being able to beginning and
one of our problems with the archive is that it doesn't belong to the university, so it belongs to Penny Shefton. It's stored in the university and it is on loan to the university on the understanding that it will come to the university upon Penny's death. But for us that creates problems because the library, our special collections in the library won't take it because it's not a university collection. So at the moment it's stored outside Newcastle in the archaeology stores, which are about 15 minutes drive from campus. So again, it makes it difficult to work on. And also because of the nature of the archive, basically it's the contents of Shefton's house. There's many personal, private material mixed in with it. And so at the moment it's not an open archive because Penny obviously is quite protective of the contents. So there's only the three of us and 224 metres of, and of course it's not part of the remit of my job. I don't have time, it's an extra. So yeah, we need, I think, to think about applying for some money so we can get an archivist. And yeah,
it's quite unusual.
They're very unusual. I think because I think Penny thinks that by keeping the archive, she's helping to secure the future because it gives her some leverage with the university. Mm-hmm. But it makes it a little bit difficult. Penny has been helping to work on the archive, but obviously there's the emotional, and I mean, even for myself, and I'm sure you feel it with Francois' archive, it's quite difficult to work on the archive of somebody that you worked with for many years and that you had a great fondness for. So I don't know that I'm the best person to be working on it either.
Yes, because you can see things that your student, your PhD student can't see, because you can decipher things that only you know. So it's important that you work on his archives.
Mm-hmm. It's just
you have an eye to grasp the information.
It's just many years' work, and
You've done all the inventory?
We've had a scoping exercise, so basically an archivist has been in and we've got a box inventory but not itemised. And the trouble is that, well, Penny believes that everything should stay as it is. Brian did have a kind of strange filing system in that he would use bags like filing cabinets. So it's almost like in the 1964 to 66, he would be using a bag, and this would then so that there is a stratigraphy to the archive, but we're not entirely convinced. Brian wasn't the most organised of people, so some boxes, and also with clearing the house into the boxes, where you fill a box isn't a natural pause in the organisation of the archive. So, I mean, I don't know, the organisation is a really interesting question, whether you leave it as it is or whether you try to reorganise it but lose.
I think that you leave it as it is.
Yes, but the trouble is, with such a big archive, if we have, say, files on the lion head, we found in various places, and kind of part of you wants to bring it all together, everything to do with one object. But no, we are leaving it as it is, but it means it's very difficult for us to locate and work with it. And the kind of organisation isn't all Brian's organisation. It's Penny when she was packing it, and I packed some of it as well. Unfortunately, we lost the library. We lost all Brian's books. Those were sold at auction in London. But we do have a very good university library because Brian was very keen to build up the library collection. So we have a Shefton collection in the library, Shefton collection of books as well. And we have a special budget. We have £1,000 a year to spend on Greek archaeology books in Shefton's name.
Shefton never tried to establish an independent library connected with the collection.
Well, he established he purchased, so his own personal library wasn't actually that fantastic because he always collected things for the university library. And we have one of the best collections for the study of Greek art and archaeology and Etruscan in the country. But sadly, since Shefton died, I think probably it's becoming less good.
My question was related to the idea of apparatus. The collection in the German tradition is established for teaching. Edward Gerhard was the first to coin the concept of having a collection of books, having a collection of objects, and having a cast collection. In a certain sense, the focus on Greek vases, more or less, which was the main interest of Shefton, has created a different structure of these apparatus. He never asked for collected casts on the...
No. So the university has a few casts, but they weren't part of the Shefton collection. He was interested much more in the smaller scale, because that was affordable as well.
Of post-Bisley effect that concentrated on basis. If you look at Tübingen, if you look at Munich, if you look at Heidelberg,
Yes, like Cambridge with the big cast collection there. Yeah, we have no casts.
My second suggestion was the moment he began to collect after war was a special moment. And at this, the same moment, the people in Germany developed also part of the previous collection. The German, the Heidelberg collection was established by Kreutzer himself. But Honor Ampé began in the 60s to collect largely Vases. And my question is, as you've seen somewhat in the relationship, the network of Shefton, he had contact with the people in Tübingen, Heidelberg.
Yes, so one of the things within the archive is lots of letters, and we haven't even began with the letters, but we know that it was, I mean, Penny talks about his networks across Europe, and particularly in Germany in the post-war years, and that he was always on the telephone to somebody or other. I mean, we've got letters as well, you know, illustrating relationship with America, letters from Dietrich von Bothmer. So I think that we will be able to trace these networks from the archive, which will help us understand even more the collection as well.
It would be interesting to have a more presentation of his network.
Yes, absolutely.
Like a media map with all the people involved in the network, after the kind of exchanges.
Yes, that would be fantastic.
When did you meet François?
I know, I'm trying to think, I've been at conferences where both Francois and Brian were there, and I got the sense they'd known each other for a long time. I don't know when they first... Oh,
In Bordeaux, in 1986, there was a meeting about trade and iconography in the 1st century with Vases, and Malgré and François. Yes, and there is a publication of this in the Revue des Études Anciennes. Yes.
In 86.
86.
I know that they both admired each other's work.
Also in Paris, in Cordoue, was François Villard. 3 days meeting also, and it is published by Cordoue, but there is a
And also an interesting topic is the link with the art markets, of course. You've talked about it, and of course it documents the evolution of the period. Of course, since the 50s and to today, everything has changed, and of course all the links an academic could have with dealers and the way he was able to build this collection is quite a very fascinating example. And you mentioned that he collected for the museum, but also for himself and for other collectors in Newcastle.
Yes. In Newcastle, although he was friendly with George Ortis, and I don't know if he advised him at times.
And his collection, the objects he kept from himself, so
they were all in the museum. This is the trouble, they're all, the records weren't kept thoroughly. So some things we suspect belong to the university, but they're still listed as belonging to Shefton, because he would often buy objects and claim the money back from the university, and so it became a little bit tangled. He kept a lot of the gold. He owns a lot of the gold that we have in the collection, and I think for him it wasn't that he wanted to keep it for himself. It was because it was an insecurity that he felt secure if he retained some of the collection. There was a period, quite a dark period, where one of the VCs wanted to close the museum. The museums have had an interesting history within the university. And yes, so I think after that he always felt apprehensive. But he was, I mean, the art market, it's a kind of a difficult topic, because in some ways the university and the museum aren't particularly keen to look at this, but I think it's very important that we do. I mean, we have a large quantity of the Dover frieze, which in recent years other museums, this is I don't know if you know it, it's been looted from Turkey, various different beautiful friezes of griffins. And other museums have pieces, a lot of other European museums, and recently they're on display without any acknowledgement. For a long time we didn't display ours because there was an anxiety about it. We do have some of it on display, but we've got boxes of it. And I think that we need to acknowledge some of the difficulties with the collection, whilst recognising that Brian was acting of his time. Brian felt very strongly, I mean, some of his friendships are with people that are now, I don't know, is the discussion recorded as well? Yes, yes, okay.
But we can edit it.
Yes, so I don't want to name names, but people that have been found to be encouraging the looting of objects in American museums. And Brian believed very strongly that all the legislation was only pushing objects into private collections where they would be lost to. So he felt that he had a mission to preserve these collections for primarily academics, but also the public, which I suppose is one way of looking at it, but it's such a difficult issue, and it's difficult now while we look at the archive and we can see where things were, you know, particularly things that may have come from Greece, and we need to have it in order. We need to know what we're dealing with, and we need to acknowledge that some of this collection is looted.
But this way of thinking was common to a lot of men of this generation. The idea of having it in a museum, it was better to having it in private hands.
You think that the attack that took place in 1984, is that correct, had a connection with the market?
Brian believed that I mean, it was before I came to Newcastle. Newcastle has a very strong tradition of marine engineering, with a lot of Greek students coming to Newcastle to take degrees. Shefton thought one possibility was that this was an act to suggest that, you know, this property should be returned to Greece. Of course, much of it didn't come from Greece, but
there's no sense.
No. I mean, it's hard to think of another reason, because the museum then in the Percy building was an obscure part, you know, it wasn't easy to find, it was in a university building. and it was kind of upstairs. So, and it was obviously, you know, a thought out attack, but it's difficult to think about. And it coincided with Shefton's retirement. So that, I believe that is what he suggested as a possible reason. Although at that time, I don't know, I've had a Greek student in one of my classes who's questioned the use of the collection and the fact that I hadn't made clear when teaching the origins of the collection, mainly because we didn't have time and just wanted to teach, but it's made me think about how I use the collection now in teaching.
Are there any requests for restitution or discussion from countries?
No, we've never had any requests. And I mean, the museum is interested in restitution, but largely for ethnographic material. So material collected in the 18th century from New Zealand and other places, because we've got quite a lot of anthropological material. And they tend to be the high profile, but to be honest, where would you return? You know, the trouble with Greek art, I mean, do you return it to the place of origin? Do you return it to the place? I mean, most of our collection, we don't have provenance for where it was, you know, found, only a few pieces. So where would you return? These are really difficult questions. And sometimes people don't actually want them, you know, want things back. But it's something we're very conscious of.
Any more questions? But well, thank you again. It was really pleasure to hear all that you talk about so much in this life and study, and we're looking forward to the discovery of the archives. Good luck with
in the coming years.
Yes. This is huge work.
Also, get everything, every ticket, every.
It's an academic mentality. I think the hoarding. I have a tendency to be a little bit of a hoarder, but Shefton's house, you couldn't, like, the books lining the staircase and piles of paper, and then he had like a little corridor to his computer with books and papers like along the edge. And Jutta was, you know, she was just as bad. She kept everything too, so that the house was kind of full. And Brian, when he'd finished with one, you know, he filled up one office, it got very messy within his house, so he just shut the door and started a new office in another room. And Jutta used to say she couldn't go to bed because he would also be laying out books and papers on the bed.
Oh,